Welcome back to the deep dive. You send us the sources, we dig in and pull out the core ideas.
Exactly. And today, this deep dive is specifically for you, listener. We're looking into a critical take on Western feminism.
Yeah, focusing on its history, how it connects or maybe disconnects with struggles around race and gender.
Our main source is a piece called A Fetus on a Dirt Road Against Imperial Feminism's Claims of Mass Rape. We also have a discussion transcript with the author.
Quite a title. So our mission today.
Well, it's really to get our heads around the main points of this critique. We want to look at the history presented and think about what it all means for how we understand feminism and liberation today.
Okay, let's jump in. The piece starts with a really stark story. Mary and Hayes Turner, May 1918. What's the context?
Right, so we're on Hampton Smith's plantation. And you have to understand, this was deep in the era of widespread, horrific lynching.
A brutal reality.
Absolutely. And the black workers there, Mary Turner included, faced just systemic abuse. Smith himself was abusive towards Mary.
And Hayes, her husband, reacted.
He did. He confronted Smith about the abuse against Mary.
Yeah.
And for doing that, for standing up for her, Hayes was beaten severely.
Wow. So tensions were already incredibly high.
Extremely high. And then, not long after, Hampton Smith was murdered.
And the immediate reaction was?
Predictable, sadly. A manhunt, looking for a black man to blame.
And Hayes Turner?
He was arrested. It fits that tragic pattern, blame assigned quickly, based on race, not evidence.
But Mary didn't just accept this.
No, she absolutely didn't. When the press came asking, she spoke out. She publicly said Hayes was innocent.
That took incredible courage.
It did. But it made her a target. This act of defiance, of speaking truth, it led to her being hunted down.
And the description of what happened next is... It's graphic.
It's profoundly disturbing. Mary, 8 or 9 months pregnant, lynched upside down, doused with gasoline, shot repeatedly.
It's almost unimaginable.
And it gets worse. The fetus was cut from her body. And then even the unborn child was beaten, its head crushed.
It's just horrifying. Why does the author start with this? What's the purpose?
The author is very explicit. It's meant to be visceral. To immediately confront the reader with what she calls the genocidal foundations of Americanism, its inherent violence, the nature of its liberalism.
So it's a foundation for the larger argument.
Exactly. A really shocking, brutal entry point into this critique of Western feminism.
Okay, so let's get into that critique. The idea that Western or imperial feminism has racist roots. What does imperial feminism mean here?
So imperial feminism in this context refers to a type of feminism the author argues was actually bound up with and supportive of colonial empires.
Not separate, but part of it.
That's the core argument. Not just running alongside empire, but integral to keeping it going, justifying it. And the author goes further, saying the racist ideas of, like, white criminologists from that era actually form a bedrock for Western feminist thought. How does that land for you, thinking about modern feminism?
It's challenging. It makes you question assumptions. So how did this play out, according to the author, this racist foundation?
Well, the argument is that, historically, Western feminism tended to view colonized people, especially women, almost like objects.
Objects.
Yeah, objects for the Western gaze. To be exoticized, maybe even subjected to violent ideas in the Western mind.
And the framework for justifying violence.
The author talks about colonial epistemologies, basically. The ways of knowing and understanding the world developed during colonialism. These ways of thinking, the argument goes, provided a sort of legal or moral cover for imperial violence in keeping colonized people down.
Like the colonizers made rules to justify their own actions.
Exactly. And this worldview then seeped into seemingly progressive movements, too, like early feminism.
Okay, so the suffragette movement, that's a key part of feminist history. How does it fit into this critique?
It comes under heavy fire here. The author draws on work by scholars like Dr. Tommy Curry to argue that the suffragette movement, including big names like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, actually used a racist strategy.
A racist strategy to get the vote.
That's the claim. The alleged aim was to put down black men, paint them as savage, unfit to vote, basically.
How did they supposedly do that?
By using racist ethnology, the so-called scientific studies of the time, to claim black men were intellectually inferior, couldn't handle governing themselves or others.
So the implication was white women first.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
That white women were more deserving of suffrage than black men. And the author sees this not as just some unfortunate historical detail.
No, it sounds like she sees it as fundamental.
Precisely. That this prioritizing of white women over black men, this racist core, taints Western feminism from root to stem.
Wow. Root to stem.
Yeah. And the critique extends even to the present, suggesting contemporary figures like Kimberly Crenshaw might still be referencing these problematic criminologists or using flawed data derived from that era.
Okay, then the focus shifts a bit to Black feminism, especially from the 1970s onwards. What's the argument there?
The author argues that as Black studies and Black feminist studies grew in the 70s, there was a kind of liberalization process,
Liberalization, meaning what?
meaning influence from figures like Gloria Steinem, and importantly, funding streams started directing money towards certain kinds of Black feminist frameworks over others.
Ah, the funding angle. What was the result of that, according to this view?
The result, the author claims, was the rise of a professional managerial kind of feminism,
Okay.
something that became more academic, maybe more disconnected from the everyday lives and struggles of the wider Black community.
And aligned with.
It's accused of having a petty bourgeois state allegiance.
So, tied to middle-class interests in the state itself, maybe even getting funds from institutions with shady origins, like alleged CIA cutouts. Does that dynamic where funding shapes a movement resonate with things you've seen elsewhere? It's certainly a recurring theme in movement histories. So, the worry is that this form of Black feminism lost its radical edge.
That's the core of it, that academia sort of absorbed it, sanded off the radical parts.
And the consequence?
The alleged consequence is that some resulting theories actually end up reinforcing racist stereotypes about Black men
How so?
by, perhaps unintentionally, framing Black men primarily as perpetrators, as rapists, maybe even implicitly justifying things like mass incarceration. The author stresses, misogyny within the Black community needs addressing, but branding a whole group is the problem.
Which leads right into this idea of the caricature of the Black male rapist. How is that seen as being formed and reproduced?
Well, the argument is this caricature has deep roots in white supremacy, obviously, but it keeps getting recycled, even in supposedly progressive circles today.
Hey.
And there's a real tension highlighted. We absolutely must address the systemic misogyny Black women face, the violence. But, the author warns, we have to do it without reducing Black men back to these harmful, simplistic, violent stereotypes.
And different views on patriarchy play into this.
Definitely. There's the view focusing mainly on women as victims of male power, but the author pushes for a broader view, one that includes how racialized men also experience violence and oppression, often from the state, from white supremacy itself.
Okay. Then there's this really strong claim about Black feminism devouring racist tropes. What does that mean?
It's a provocative phrase, for sure. The idea is that instead of dismantling these old racist stereotypes, some forms of Black feminism have maybe internalized them and use them within their own analysis.
Can you give an example?
The author critiques the concept of intersectional invisibility. The concern is that sometimes this concept might be used in ways that actually obscure the specific suffering of Black women by overly focusing on, say, the public violence against Black men.
So the question becomes, is intersectionality always capturing all the overlaps, or can it sometimes flatten things?
That seems to be the concern raised, yeah. And it connects to a critique of sisterhood within some Black feminist circles.
How so?
The argument is that sometimes this sisterhood feels conditional, like you have to agree on everything, and worse, it might even form around what the author calls anti-Black bonding.
Anti-Black bonding, meaning?
A solidarity based partly on shared negative stereotypes about Black men. In contrast, the author holds up figures like Claudia Jones or Queen Mother Moore, women who fought for their communities, for Black liberation as a whole, but didn't necessarily use the label feminist in the way we might today.
For them, it was about the whole community.
Exactly. Liberation was about Black life, full stop, not a separate feminism.
Okay, moving to the relationship with Black power movements. What's the critique there?
The author argues that Black feminism, or certain strains of it, have been used sometimes to kind of delegitimize the more militant Black power movements.
By focusing on sexism within those movements?
Partly, yes. Citing work by bell hooks on figures like George Jackson is given as an example. The claim is that if you paint all revolutionary Black nationalism as just inherently patriarchal, it tends to push people towards reformism, towards working within the system, rather than seeking more radical change.
And what gets lost in that view, according to the author?
What gets lost or erased is the major role Black women did play in those revolutionary movements. Think Ida B. Wells, women in the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
There's a long history there.
Right.
And there's criticism, too, of figures like Alice Walker or Michelle Wallace, suggesting that seeking validation from the state aligns them with the existing power structures, capitalist, white supremacist, heteronormative, rather than fighting for real liberation from them.
There's also a distinction made between patriarchy and misogyny here.
Yes, emphasizing that white supremacy historically stripped black men of conventional manhood, and applying a simple idea of black male patriarchy ignores or distorts that history.
This feels like it touches on old debates, like race versus class.
It does. The author explicitly makes that parallel. The danger, highlighted again, is subordinating one analysis to another.
So even with intersectionality as a tool.
Right. The concern is that in practice, race and class analysis can sometimes get pushed aside in favor of a primary focus on gender.
Any examples?
The author uses domestic violence, arguing that explaining it only through the lens of male violence misses the complexity, and points out that black men as victims of sexual and domestic violence are often underrepresented in some feminist writing.
Okay. The discussion then pivots quite sharply to Palestine. How is that connection made?
The author points to a specific New York Times article, noting one author identifies as feminist. The critique is that this article demonized Hamas while allegedly ignoring systemic sexualized violence against Palestinians by the Israeli state.
And this introduces the idea of double genocide.
Yes, the concept is twofold. The physical violence, but also killing the ability of Palestinians to tell their own story, their own truth.
So demonizing them makes it easier to dismiss their experiences.
That's the argument. It primes people to reject their accounts of suffering. And this connects back to the black experience.
How?
By drawing a line to what's called the rapist-rapey dialectic applied to black men. That same pattern, demonize a group as sexually violent, which then justifies violence against them and makes their own claims of victimhood unbelievable.
And Palestinian women in this.
The argument is they're often degendered in the eyes of oppressors, meaning their experiences of sexual terror might not even be recognized as sexual assault.
There's another term used here, suppliality.
Yeah, suppliality, describing Palestinians existing in this limbo state between life and death, constantly under threat, denied control over their own narrative.
Then comes this really intense phrase, the homoerotic consumptive appetite of capitalist imperialism. What's that about?
It's deliberately provocative. The author's arguing that capitalist imperialism has this deep-seated, disturbing desire, a kind of consumptive appetite framed as homoerotic for the actual bodies, the flesh and blood of colonized people.
Both Palestinian and black men.
Yes. Referencing Vincent Woodard's book, The Delectable Negro, to talk about a necrophilic, psychosexual drive within white supremacy.
What are the examples given?
Things like the historical eroticization of lynchings by white crowds, the sexual access slave owners had, and even recent cases like black men sexually assaulted by white police officers in Mississippi.
And the connection to black feminism.
The argument is that some strands of black feminism struggle to fully grapple with the sexual abuse of black men because it complicates the narrative of black men being solely perpetrators.
Okay, this is a lot. It leads to a huge question. Can feminism, given all this, be redeemed?
Right. The author acknowledges listeners might align with anti-imperialist or transnational feminisms already, sharing some critiques, and acknowledges the real dangers women face, especially with the political right rising. But the assertion is firm. Mainstream Western feminism doesn't own the concept of women's liberation. So the big question posed is, can this feminism, especially in the U.S. context where it's increasingly institutionalized, liberal, can it be salvaged, resuscitated for radical change?
What alternatives are suggested?
Pointing back to those figures like Claudia Jones, Queen Mother Moore, women in anti-colonial struggles who fought for liberation without necessarily calling it feminism.
So the work is the key thing.
The argument is that the work of helping women is just part of the broader liberation struggle. It doesn't need a separate avism necessarily.
Marxist thinkers are also mentioned?
Yes, so people like Engels, Marx, Huey Newton, Harry Haywood thinkers who analyze women's conditions within their larger frameworks of oppression.
And contemporary rights movements.
They get critiqued if they become too culturalist or detached from radical politics. Even language like women and non-men is criticized as potentially divisive, called anti-black nonsense.
So the ultimate argument is
that women's liberation is inherent within genuine anti-imperialist, Marxist, Pan-African struggles for the liberation of all oppressed people. It's not separate.
And finally, the critique circles back to Western Marxism itself.
Yes, arguing it hasn't escaped its own problems. Liberal hijacking, paternalism, maybe even chauvinism.
In what way?
By underrating imperialism, glossing over racism, promoting vague anti-racism, instead of concrete self-determination for oppressed groups.
Similar to the co-option argument earlier.
Exactly. Drawing parallels to how the civil rights movement was arguably co-opted by the state, and suggesting Western Marxism often dismisses more radical analyses as, authoritarian or not nuanced.
Becoming too comfortable with the status quo.
Becoming reformist, compatible with the state referencing compatible left theory. Domenico Lerdo's book on Western Marxism is recommended for analyzing this alleged chauvinistic liberalism within it.
So a critique of historical and ongoing issues within these movements.
Yeah, focus on integration and reforms rather than fundamental change. The author finishes by stressing the need for real struggle, self-critique, deep connection to communities, moving beyond just theory.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely an intense deep dive. Some really challenging ideas presented there. Thanks for walking us through it.
Absolutely. The goal, as always, isn't necessarily agreement, but understanding the arguments laid out in the sources you provide, however complex or difficult they might be.
Right. So hopefully for you, our listener, this gives you a framework to think more about the history and the current relevance of these critiques of feminism, of the left, more broadly.
And maybe a final thought to chew on. How does this historical lens change how you view current movements? What does it suggest about the challenges of building solidarity, of creating frameworks that truly address race, class, and gender together in a ways that aims for genuine liberation for everyone?